Hello and welcome. I'm Rif Itzhaki, Impact Director at the Mitvim Institute, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. And today we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Aziz Al-Rashian, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Gulf International Forum and a leading expert on Saudi foreign policy. Dr. Al-Rashian has made valuable contributions to Mitvim's regional work, and I'm glad to call him our policy fellow. And today we will be discussing the implications of President Donald Trump's visit to the Middle East for Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the entire region. Dr. Al-Rashian, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Reef. It's a great pleasure to join you. Thank you for this invitation.
Thank you. So for the first question, I just want to ask you, President Trump's recent visit to the Middle East notably excluded Israel while placing renewed strategic emphasis on Saudi Arabia and signaling interest in new partnerships with emerging players like Syria. So what are your key takeaways from this visit? And were there any aspects that you surprised with?
Let me start off by saying, I'm going to come from a very Saudi-centric perspective, and also I'll stick in my lane and look at the Saudi policy towards Israel and policy towards Palestine and Israel. In my opinion, I think this avoidance of dealing with Israel or keeping them here is almost unsurprising, because I think, unfortunately, Netanyahu has made an association with Israel too toxic, and therefore, I think Donald Trump knows that this is something that's going to be too much of an ask from other Arab states, and particularly Saudi Arabia. Even in the meeting that he had in the Saudi-U.S. economic, I think it'd be investment forum, where he gave that speech, he spoke about the Abraham Accords and maybe joining the Abraham Accords, but he didn't mention Saudi-Israel normalization. And I think for me, it was an articulation that spoke to the Abraham Accords as his own legacy, rather than kind of a real regional question, a real regional shift in dynamics. And this, to me, what makes this stand out, or what really stood out for me, is how, and I of course say this with respect, I'm always someone who's saying, listen, there's a difference between the Israeli government and Israeli people and Israeli society, but I want you to know I'm not lumping everyone together. But he made Israel lose agency in the region. And this is, Netanyahu made lose agency in the region. And he just simply made it even more of a part of an American-Saudi transactional deal. That if you do this, then you have, normalize relations, and we get this and we get that. So I think for me, the fact that he avoided Netanyahu on this trip emphasized that the real strategic goals is to deal with players in the region like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, like UAE, and therefore, I think they are the ones that are going to bring a lot of interest, obviously, to the United States. They can't, and I mean, Israel can't match, I think, the spending power that these countries have. But at the same time, for me, I think what stood out was really this aspect of agency, that it's becoming more and more a smaller file within the Saudi American and Gulf American discussion.
I see. So as you mentioned, like the emphasis here is definitely Saudi Arabia. And I just want to understand something here. From Riyadh's perspective, what message did this visit send to the region and to Israel in particular?
Yeah. So I think that Saudi Arabia is becoming de facto the center of gravity of the region. And one can also argue that to a larger scale that the GCC is becoming the center of gravity of the region. And Saudi, in the biggest country in that, is therefore arguably the center of gravity of the region. And I think the results that came out of this, the fact that Donald Trump declared that he will remove sanctions, willing to normalize relations with Syria, suggests that Saudi diplomacy has been proactive and also delivers. In my opinion, it was probably a low-hanging fruit. It was something that was there that the Saudis have been actually working hard on. And therefore, I think they are trying to change the contours of the geopolitical landscape in the region. And of course, we know Syria is going through still a difficult time. Many people are kind of still in jubilation mode about the post-Assad era, which is yes, indeed, but Syria is still very precarious. And I think there is a desire from either Iran or others to perhaps go back again. You hear a lot of the times people saying, "Hey, we're not finished there. We're still going to go back. It's still not over," etc. So it's interesting to see, in my opinion, that there is a gradual process of trying to bring Syria into the Arab fold. And I think this process of removing sanctions helps do two things. It helps the reintegration of Syria into the Arab fold, but also it helps the Arab states, in particular the GCC states, to bring Syria into the Arab fold. Why? Because I think we are very, we are also overstretched when it comes to spending money. In past years, we've been very prudent regarding spending money, spending it elsewhere outside our borders. And therefore, we won't spend money unless we are very confident in political developments and make sure that these are going to the right places. So I think there is that combination of, if you remove sanctions, injections will begin to, good financial injections will start to flow into the country in conjunction with Saudi support and GCC support. Then you see a real process and momentum building towards a fundamental reintegration into Syria into the region.
So now I want to go back in time and ask you something from also Saudi perspective, or would say focusing on Israel here more. So before the current government, Israel positioned itself as a proactive player in shaping regional diplomacy. However, there is a growing sense that it is now perceived as blocking rather than advancing regional initiatives. So from your perspective, how is Israel's current role viewed in Saudi Arabia? As a partner for progress or as a spoiler?
Certainly the latter. Certainly the spoiler. There was once a time where people have viewed Israel possibly as a potential partner. And this is something you heard even from MBS himself in 2021. He said that Israel is actually a potential ally, 2021, so not long ago. But I would even argue that that perception has evolved for decades, and there were critical junctions that helped it evolve. But in my opinion, I think the Arab Spring was really perhaps the thing that made people perceive Israel potentially very differently, because there was a great deal of alignment there, a regional alignment. But I think the political landscape in Israel, the political volatility, the Netanyahu effect has just made people realize in Saudi Arabia that this is actually a lot more I would say a lot more difficult than we thought. But yes, we now know why, or it reminded them of the controversy of dealing with Israel. Before it was a momentum that was building towards this. Then it was saying, you see, it spoke back to some of the anxieties that people had before. And quite frankly, even more so, because I think, especially after the Abraham Accords, there was that willingness, there was that hope from the GCC, some GCC signatories to it, UAE and Bahrain, that maybe it could lead to something good. Maybe it could have some progress. But in fact, as you know more than I would, the Abraham Accords was manipulated into something very malevolent. And basically, it was framed by some circles, especially the extremists, that this is the ultimate circumnavigation of the Palestinian issue. And therefore, this is why it's so good. So I think for me, and another point, because it's worth mentioning, before October 7th, there were these discussions of Saudi-Israeli normalization, if they got what they wanted from the United States and there were enough concessions from Israel. At that point, in my opinion, peace and normalization were so far apart. Many people were pushing for that kind of normalization because they wanted to make sure that the Palestinian issue is not being brought up again. This is how I perceive it and how many others also perceive it. So I think now it's a recalibration of normalization. The perception of normalization has changed, and the perception of Israel has changed. I mean, I'll be very honest. I remember when I was remember when I was a kid in Saudi, and that's when the second Intifada happened, and Israel then was obviously perceived very negatively. I didn't see that sentiment rise again till now, till the recent years. So it is significant. Even when there were skirmishes and little bouts of conflict and wars going on in May 2021, et cetera, et cetera. But it did not match what was happening in the sentiment. And there's just the last thing I promise, and I'll be quiet after this. The Saudi understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli dynamics has evolved, in my opinion. I think they began to understand some of the iniquitous processes that Netanyahu has of of managing the conflict, of kind of keeping the moderates oppressed, weak, emboldening the extremists, and therefore they actually see Israel obviously complicit with not just what's going on in Gaza, but with other malevolent things that are taking place in the region. So the public opinion is it took one step forward and then took probably 100 steps backwards.
Right. So maybe now I would like to finish this interview with a positive note. It depends on your answer, I guess. And not about Israel at all, but more about regional dynamics here. And let's go back to the future or nowadays. And during the summit, regional stabilization was a key topic of discussion, with Syria emerging as a central focus, especially following the surprising meeting between Trump, MBS, and El Shara, which granted legitimacy to Syria's new government. So in light of these developments, what is Saudi Arabia's long-term vision for Syria's role in the Middle East? And what is its overall vision for the regional stabilization process?
In my opinion, when you look at Saudi 2030 was conceived in an era or an environment of really almost at the height of Saudi nationalism. And that's when you heard some of these the Saudi first slogan. of course, recycled from the American political discourse. But you hear the Saudi first approach, the Saudi first approach. And Saudi first at that time meant Saudi and only Saudi to a certain extent. Um, Now I think it's Saudi and others. Saudi, I think, realized that 2030 vision cannot succeed or will be very difficult to succeed, or at least will not achieve the real potential unless there's a regional stability. And also, I think some of the conflicts that took place right now that are taking place illustrated how big the Saudi borders are, and how there are conflicts on multiple fronts, and that's where a lot of the projects are. It's on these on these different fronts or close to it. So Saudi Arabia needs regional stability. The issue is, not only can we ask how can Saudi Arabia play a role in strengthening regional stability, but how can we help Saudi strengthen regional stability? And in my opinion, this is where we have to start investing in a more a more astute, pragmatic discourse of speaking to other people's interests and speaking to other people's anxieties as well. So when people want Saudi Arabia to play a bigger role, sometimes people in Saudi say, this means you want me to stop what I'm doing and just focus on sorting out your issues. No, we're going to have to sort out our issues first. And that's what Saudi first is. But that being said, I think if there is a way of saying, listen, your interest is really in my interest, and then we begin to institutionalize this is actually part of the things that I've been doing with Mitvim with you guys, then I think that's something we could then we could go forward. And it's the same thing with Shara, because Ahmed al-Shara was saying the right things. And that's what spoke to Saudis, and that's what enabled him and MBS to actually lobby for al-Shara. I mean, had they heard things differently, had they heard things like, you know what, we really need to strengthen this because we need to take over this and we need to take over that and we need to expand here and we need to expand here and we need to do this, they're not going to be supporters of this. But instead, I really believe, and from what I've also heard in various discussions, that, listen, they've been saying the right things, and therefore they've gained, I think, the Saudi confidence. And so it's an illustration, really, of a process. And we have to, and to end on a positive note, if the horizon is convincing and the horizon is tangible, then we're going to elicit a lot of proactivity from really important players. So that's what I think the challenge that we have to have, is to show the hanging fruits and show the tangibility of these objectives, and then they will strive towards it.
So although the challenges, it was very positive for a very promising summit, I would say. So Dr. El'Ghashian, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Really, your perspective is invaluable in understanding the dynamics between US, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the broader regional picture. So thank you again.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.